I'm joined by Will Kingston, host of Fire at Will, a podcast from The Spectator on politics and culture, and Sky News commentator Joe Hildebrand. Will, Albanese didn't act that fast and publicly when the Chinese Navy deliberately hurt Australian Navy divers with their sonar 18 months ago, but is he right to at least protest about the Americans now?
Well, I don't think he has much of a choice, Andrew. When an Australian journalist gets shot by an American cop, it's not necessarily something you could let go through to the keeper as an Australian politician. And, you know, I'm all for firsts on this show, and I think this is a first on this show. I'm completely with Albo on this one. It did look pretty unambiguous. It did look like the cop lined her up and shot her. I would make a distinction between one police officer and the Californian police force more generally. But I think Albanese is absolutely right in raising this with the relevant people in the US, because it does look like a pretty poor attack on a journalist, which in my view was deliberate.
Joe Hildebrand, that policeman seemed to fire from very close range. Yep. And I tend to go with Will and with the Prime Minister. It did seem to me deliberate.
Yeah, either it was deliberate or that guy is the worst shot in the history of US law enforcement and probably shouldn't be carrying a firearm. It was, at the very least, I mean, even if we're to believe that there was some kind of legitimate target behind Laura, it defies credibility. It's difficult to even say with a straight face. But the fact that he fired when she was clearly in the line of fire, self-evidently in the line of fire, and appeared to turn around and actually go after her deliberately, I think is absolutely disgraceful, and Albo is absolutely right to raise it. I find it actually quite baffling and creepy that it happened.
In fact, the cameraman panned behind her, you know, as he turned in shock or whatever, and I didn't see anything behind him to suggest that that was a legitimate target either. No. Interesting gossip today, Will. An ally of former Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, Jackie Blackwell, is running to be chairman next Monday of the Federal Electoral Committee of his former seat of Kooyong, now held by Teal independent Monique Ryan. I think it's now unopposed after Amelia Hamer dropped out. This strongly suggests to me that Frydenberg is considering a return to politics, although obviously he's not committing to anything anytime soon. Do you think the federal Liberals need him back?
Yeah, I do. I think they need all of the talented people they can get. There's an interesting question as to why he would want to come back at the moment, Andrew. And I would see this idea with people like Josh Frydenberg. And I had this conversation with Joe on the late debate a couple of weeks ago. I'm increasingly of the view that the broad church is no longer viable in modern Australian politics. That mixture of social conservatives and classical liberals. I think there is a lane for a new right-wing party in Australia. I think someone like a Josh Frydenberg would actually be a very interesting person to be involved in a movement like that. There is obviously some work that would need to be done in trying to unite the grab bag of minor parties on the right in Australia. But for someone like Frydenberg, that would actually be a very interesting alternative for me. That's what I would be thinking if I was in his shoes.
Well, I hope you're not dreaming that he'd be a right-wing leader, because I don't think he'd be interested in that too much. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually think that Josh Frydenberg is probably the only figure who can unite the broad church as it was and as John Howard described it. He's someone who I think both moderates and the centre-right faction, of which is a part, or the national right, they respect him. They both respect him. They can both live with him. He's seen, I think, as having good conservative credentials, but not being too far to the right. And I would imagine that given that Monique Ryan almost lost her seat with Peter Dutton as leader, I would think if Susan Ley makes it all the way to 2028, she would be in real trouble, and I would dare say you could put the house on her losing if it was Frydenberg himself who ran against her. And I think for all of those reasons, you know, revenge, a possible tilt at the Prime Ministership, I imagine he'd be handed the leadership on a platter as soon as he re-entered the Parliament. I think that's very difficult for anyone of Josh's talent and ambition to say no to.
It seems to me, Will, that left-wing opinion shows are falling like flies around us. I mean, the other day, or I think it was this week, yesterday I think it was, The Project on Channel 10 gone. The Sydney Morning Herald's now reporting that long-running ABC program Q&A, which has always been a left-wing stack, is about to be axed. My goodness, what's going on, do you think?
Yeah, it's morning again in Australian media, Andrew. What a week. And look, it is a shame about Q&A because you're right. It is, just left-wing partisan hackery. But the concept is really good. And the idea of having debates on important issues, bringing together, people from the left and the right, which is, I think, what it was meant to be before it just got ideologically captured, is a really noble ambition. So I think, the actual concept, I hope, is something that we see more of in Australian media. I'm not hopeful, but unfortunately, that is not what the show ended up as.
Yep.
Oh, no, when I went on there back in the day, I was totally set up. I got out of it and laughed, but, I was the one Conservative, and they lined up a climate scientist in the audience to try and ask me try to get me on two different questions. It's really ridiculous. He failed, but the bad faith was so clear there. What do you make of it, Joe? You're going to be weeping tears for the demise of Q&A?
Right. Yeah, look, I don't like to see any show go under, but the truth is that the left killed Q&A. The left killed it on a number of levels. One was, as you say, I think despite all the best intentions, a lot of the people who were lining up the guests would see the panel as being balanced, whereas people on the right, Conservatives, would say, what are you talking about? A famous example is when a ultra-conservative rabbi from New York had to pull out at the last minute, and they put me on. They asked if I could go on in his place. And I said, you do realise you've replaced a Jewish conservative with a Labor voting Catholic. You do know that we're not. But I think they actually probably thought that I was a Jewish conservative. So I think that is the problem. You've got all these crazy lefties who actually think Q&A is gone too far to the right, if you can believe that.
That's just extraordinary. The boos alone would tell you where the audience was on that. Just very quickly, 10 seconds. Greta Thunberg, Will, what has she achieved by getting herself arrested by the Israelis?
Not much. She obviously missed her opportunity at Yacht Week as a teenager, and so this was her chance to get a Mediterranean cruise holiday in. I think that's the extent of it.